You are listening to Radio Data, a podcasting radio where we talk about data, cloud, analytics, and AI with different guests, different hosts, and in different segments. This segment is called Data Journey, where our guests talk about how data moves around in their company, what technologies they use, and what value data brings to their products. Hello everyone! Today our guest is Wouter de Bie. Wouter currently lives in New Orleans in the US, and he has been working with big data for around 12 years. Wouter originally comes from the Netherlands, but he has spent most of his time working with data in Sweden and the US, where he worked at Spotify, the New York Times, and now at Datadog. A very important disclaimer for this conversation is the fact that I know Wouter personally for exactly 10 years, because we worked together at Spotify and we built data infrastructure there. Wouter actually recruited me, and he was the tech leader of one of the teams that I worked in. So this was 10 years ago, but since then a lot of has changed in the big data landscape, and I will be happy to ask Wouter many questions about his thoughts and opinions. But let's start with the introduction first. Who is Wouter de Bie? Could you please introduce yourself?
Of course. Thank you, Adam. First of all, thank you for having me. This is so much fun doing a podcast with you. And as you said, we met 10 years ago when I hired you at Spotify, and we've done quite a bit of stuff actually together, road tripping Poland to do meetups and things like that, talks all over the place. Anyway, I'm Wouter. As you mentioned, I'm originally from the Netherlands. Sometimes I still have a slight accent, but it's not that big anymore. Who I am. It's there's many facets to this, but I'm early on I was a kid with a computer, and that sort of eventually evolved in me doing big data, early 2010. Going from data engineer, infrastructure engineer to team lead manager, and now I'm a director of engineering at Datadog. On one hand, building data infrastructure at Datadog, and on the other hand, leading our analytics department.
Yes. The time that we worked together at Spotify was so much fun, and I'm sure that we'll talk about Spotify later in this podcast episode, but let's start first our conversation with Datadog. So could you please tell us more about Datadog? What is your company doing? What customers do you have? And how and why they are using your products?
Absolutely. So Datadog we specialize in monitoring and observability, and particularly in the cloud. So if you have an infrastructure, preferably in the cloud, then you can basically send us your monitoring and observability data, and that's think about CPU usage, memory usage of instances that you run in the cloud, but also application metrics. And we do that according to sort of three pillars. So one is metrics. You just send us your metrics. We do logs. So send us your logs. We can search through them, index them. You can sort of analyze your logs in different ways. And then application performance monitoring, so adding what we call traces to your application and understanding how your applications perform, and that across microservices. One of the interesting use cases there for me is that nowadays, a lot of microservices talk to each other, and a user request might end up in a bunch of different services. We can sort of collate those requests and figure out where performance bottlenecks are, for example, or where things go wrong. That obviously comes with a lot of data. We operate in the cloud. We operate in multiple clouds, actually. So AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud Platform. We ingest a lot of data for our customers. So big customers of ours are Airbnb, for example, is a large one. A whole bunch of banks and insurance companies. A lot of folks who or a lot of companies that operate in the cloud and want to sort of monitor their infrastructure.
In the meantime, I'm also checking your website, and I see customers such as Samsung, Siemens, Sony, and Sainsbury, and also customers which names doesn't start with S, like Delivery Hero, Evernote, Lego. And this list is very impressive. But let's move on to the tech stack. What are the most important technologies that you use at Datadog for data infrastructure, data engineering, and data analytics?
So on the data engineering side, most of our ETL pipelines are written in Spark, Scala, Spark, instrumented by Luigi, which is for me was very much full circle, because we built Luigi with the team at Spotify back in the day. And then we've recently added Flink to our sort of palette of tools that we can give to data engineers. And then on the analytics side, it's mostly Snowflake, and we've started to dabble in like DBT as of recently, so adding DBT to the mix. We're experimenting currently with Airbyte for ingestion of different data from different business systems. I think that's sort of the big picture, and then there's tons of glue stuff and like small little glue applications, a bunch of Python, a bunch of Golang, like UIs for all sorts of different things. But the main sort of open source technology that we use is like Spark, Flink, and then proprietary Snowflake, DBT.
Yes. I noticed that you also mentioned only cloud agnostic technologies, open source ones such as Spark, Flink, DBT, Airbyte, or Luigi, and commercial ones such as Snowflake. Is it intentional because you use multiple cloud providers such as GCP, AWS, Azure, or on-prem? And would you like to have similar tech stack in each environment?
Exactly, because we want to leverage, we want to make the experience for data engineers at Datadog as sort of coherent and consistent as possible. And we could obviously use a bunch of the cloud technologies. So think like if you have a SQL solution, we could use BigQuery in GCP, we could use Redshift in AWS, etc. But that's really like tricky. So therefore, we opt for cloud agnostic technology, and we build some stuff ourselves.
Yes, this totally makes sense, and it definitely makes the life of data engineers simpler. However, does it have any pain points, or does it bring any challenges to Datadog as a company?
So obviously we have to build like interfaces and sort of tools around these kind of things, and we often have to maintain things ourselves. Like for example, so one of the things that we're currently working on is moving away from Dataproc and EMR in AWS. Historically, so Datadog started in AWS. That was sort of where we still have our largest footprint, but that's where everything started. And so at the beginning of building data infrastructure, we basically connected with EMR. So Spark jobs are just like we fire up an EMR cluster, and then we send the workloads there. When we moved into GCP, we did a similar thing, and then build stuff on top of Dataproc. However, with the addition of Azure, one of the harder things becomes like you add additional complexity. So in that case, we would have had to add HD insights to the mix. Now, one of the complexities there was that you deal with like versioning, right? Like if you run a Spark job, then you're like sometimes the Linux kernel matters, not too much, but Linux kernel version is something to take into account. Then Java version or JDK or JRE versions, Scala version, Spark version, and then there's the whole Hadoop ecosystem where you often also need to compile against. So with like three clouds, that became really, really tricky. So we're actually moving towards running Spark directly on Kubernetes, because we as Datadog operate our own Kubernetes clusters. So that actually becomes easier to sort of manage, because it's like a single platform across multiple clouds. But obviously, we'll have to build things ourselves that other clouds already have built, something like EMR for spinning up and tearing down clusters, things like that. So I think it's it really depends on kind of the strategy that you follow. And in our case, because we are multi-cloud, we'll have to, works for us well, I think, yeah.
Could you also tell us some information about your scale at Datadog? How many data engineers and data infrastructure engineers are working at Datadog, given the fact that you work with multiple cloud providers?
So just for the data engineering part, so not everything is data engineering at Datadog, right? Like our live systems is a completely different world. Data engineering is mostly used for sort of offline use cases. There are many of those, but think billing is one, like usage metering and billing. We have a thing called historical metrics, where metrics that are older than 24 hours go through an ETL process. But nevertheless, so we have this thing called a data engineering communities, like all the data engineers getting together, and that's data engineers, analysts, or analytics engineers, I must say, and data infrastructure. That community is about 220 people big. And currently we have about 30 people working on data infrastructure itself.
Yes, this is quite large community and quite large team. And when answering to this question, you mentioned that the main focus for data engineers at Datadog is put on implementing offline use cases. However, as a one technology in your data stack, you also mentioned Apache Flink. So could you tell us more how you use Apache Flink and what real-time streaming use cases at Datadog you implement?
Yeah, so like Datadog itself is a real-time system, and there's a lot of bespoke storage and bespoke processing that has been built over the years to deal with logs, to deal with time series, to deal with traces. So that's all very bespoke and very sort of use case specific to Datadog. On the data engineering side, within the last 6 months or so, we've added Flink as a tool in our toolbox for data engineers, and to do, kind of what you would do in Spark, but then in a more real-time fashion. And we see that there are more and more use cases sort of popping up where we need some sort of a Lambda architecture sometimes, where we have like a real-time data coming in and then followed with an ETL job, or where some teams need to sort of drink from a Kafka fire hose in order to update state. Or to calculate things like anomaly detection, for example, at large scale. And there we more and more people start to use Apache Flink for that.
We talked a bit about some challenges of building a product that works seamlessly on different cloud providers. But what if we speak more broadly? What are the most interesting challenges that you have at Datadog, of course related to the data, analytics, and cloud?
So technically, I think like one of the things is that how I see our sort of data platform, which basically consists of sort of all the functionality that you require from a data platform. I always tend to look at sort of 5 or 6 dimensions. It's storage, processing, scheduling and orchestration, data management and governance, a build environment where artifacts get built that can then be deployed and run, and some ad hoc querying capabilities. We kind of have all that. It's somewhat rough around the edges, like Luigi being one of those things. Luigi is, it's old, it's somewhat arcane, but so we're looking at to sort of like what to do next with Luigi. But so it's a little rough around the edges, but all the functionality is there. And the big challenge is now to sort of how do we keep that platform like going while at the same time build a better user experience? Because I think in data engineering in general, there's a lot of what I like to call peripheral work that's being done. So while I would really like data engineers to focus predominantly on their business logic, so either be their Spark code or their Apache Flink code, rather than having to deal with spend a lot of time dealing with dependency management, with configuration, with building artifacts, with their data management, like all that type of stuff. I think we can automate and we can abstract away, but so that's where we're currently focused on, and that's where really the biggest challenges lie. Like how do we make a platform that is user friendly, while still sort of keeping I would say backwards compatibility per se, but just to keep the boat afloat.
Okay, and are the expectations that come from the users of your platform changing over time? I'm asking this question because you have been working with big data technologies for 12 years, and you know that what was user-friendly 12 years ago is no longer user-friendly today. So basically, how requirements to build the better user experience is impacting the design and the evolution of your data platform at Datadog?
Absolutely. I think a lot has changed over the last 12 years or so since I started doing data engineering and data infrastructure. It really felt back in the day when you and I met, there were so many different technologies out there, and we sort of had to figure out what was the right one for the job. I think Spark is pretty ubiquitous nowadays. If you don't use something like Apache Beam, or maybe some other more niche technologies, but I think as a data eng community, across a global community, we've pretty much settled, I think, on Spark, but that was very different. Back in the day, we started off with MapReduce, just writing plain old MapReduce in Java, or in Spotify's case, it was even Python. So that definitely has changed. Scheduling and orchestration has changed from Uzi, which is super XML driven and not very friendly for the user, through things like Luigi, Azkaban, now to Airflow is pretty much the default thing. So I think over time a lot has changed, and a lot has lots of standardization, I think, has happened, which also means that for say Datadog and data engineers there, things change, and new people we hire obviously come with experience in more sort of current systems. So there's an expectation that things are a little easier than working with Luigi, for example. Things do change. It's an interesting challenge, though, because at the same time we have people that have been at Datadog for forever, for example, and know all ins and outs and all little quirks of Luigi, and are really fluent in writing some Luigi code, and don't really feel the pain that much. But that's something I tend to not optimize for. I would rather optimize for sort of new joiners. We're a company that's still in hypergrowth. We're recruiting like crazy, new people joining, and that's where really sort of the efficiency gains lie, rather than folks that have been at it for a while. Nevertheless, we still also need to keep those people happy, right?
Yes. So when you mentioned technologies such as Snowflake, Airbyte, dbt, I started thinking about the term or buzzword that I believe you also have heard many times, that is modern data platform. Because very often technologies such as Snowflake or dbt are part of so-called modern data platform that simplifies how you implement data pipelines and provide easier, more user-friendly frameworks, and often support for SQL as a data processing language that for many use cases is very convenient. So is it intentional that you followed those trends and you build own modern data platform, or is it rather the selection of the technologies that currently work best for Datadog?
No, it's intentionally. Some of it is kind of unintentionally or luck. I would say, like for us moving to Snowflake, so we used to have data in Redshift, which worked okay, I would say, in AWS. But as soon as we had data in multiple clouds, all of a sudden we needed to have something that cut across all the clouds. And then Snowflake is was a good piece of technology there. It's also that like Snowflake in our case is much more powerful than Redshift, which means that we can actually start doing ELT instead of ETL. So either or defer like processing at query time, or run something like DBT in the middle where you can actually do a lot of processing there. Sort of similar to like at my time at Spotify, where we moved from on-prem to the cloud. We moved from Hive, which basically MapReduce, to BigQuery, and that was a massive game changer. I think initially this was just because of speed, but there's the additional benefit of being more user friendly. Like it's easier to write SQL, right, than it is to write a MapReduce job. So I think some of these things at Datadog at least are somewhat unintentional, but definitely now the strategy is very intentional to make something that is more user friendly and therefore more, I would say, organizationally scalable. It's easier to hire people that know how to write SQL than to hire people that know how to write Scala or Spark in Scala. So it's today it's very intentional to sort of move there, and we don't use that term modern data platform, but it's more like we've just focused on self-serve a lot, so that analysts, for example, can write their own models in dbt and write their own queries against Snowflake rather than having a data engineer involved to write a whole pipeline for you.
And are there any trends that you intentionally follow at Datadog that might impact how your data platform looks like in 2 or 3 years?
Well, I follow the industry a little bit, but I don't think we're particularly influenced by trends. It is more, so Datadog is a very pragmatic company. Like the culture is very sort of, there's a lot of pragmatism there. Like you have a problem, you want to solve that, and you find a solution for it, or you build a solution for it. And so from that perspective, we don't tend to follow trends, but it kind of makes sense, right? Like it kind of makes sense to move a lot. For example, move from ETL to ELT in large parts. There will always be a place for ETL where there's very bespoke business logic and things like that. But to that extent, I think we just it was at the right moment that this happened for us, where technology emerged that we could actually leverage. But rather than trends, I think maybe in the future, like one thing that we don't do a lot of is we don't have a lot of ML infrastructure, so that's sort of the next big thing in a few years. So if coming back to your question, like what would our sort of infrastructure look like in sort of a few years from now? There's probably much more ML infrastructure besides just sort of plain old data infrastructure.
When I introduced you, I also mentioned that you worked at Spotify for many years, and it was a very interesting chapter in your life. So what are the biggest differences between Spotify and Datadog when you look at data, technologies, and your work and the solutions that you built?
Well, I think the big difference was that when I started at Spotify, everything was on premise. So everything was, you and I together built a 3,600 node Hadoop cluster. I think at the time was like the biggest in Europe. And then we moved to the cloud. So a lot of the workloads we had to move to the cloud. We had to like pick particular technologies. But it was also, we moved to Google's cloud platform. So all of a sudden we had the ability to actually leverage what Google has. So as I mentioned earlier, like BigQuery, a lot of stuff was moved to Apache, or to Dataflow, which Apache Beam. We built a lot of tools on top of that. So Spotify built Shio, which is like a a Scala bindings on top of Apache Beam. So like a lot of focus was on that. And the big difference with Datadog is that Datadog started in the cloud, albeit AWS. So a lot of the infrastructure was sort of built around AWS technology, as I mentioned earlier. Like we used, and still up to this day, we use EMR. But then multi-cloud changes everything, right? So you have to start thinking in like generalizations and different abstractions. So it's building infrastructure with a very different, different view. And also we're a few years later now, so there is different technology. Mm-hmm. But in general, I would say like at Spotify, we really focus initially just like keeping this thing running. Like operating 3,600 node Hadoop cluster is somewhat difficult. I think the way that Luigi, for example, was built was not very user friendly. One of my big beefs with Luigi, and I don't know if the original authors are going to listen to this, but one of my biggest beefs with Luigi nowadays is that there are no abstractions. Like it's a Python framework, and you code your way out of that. Like you pretty much in code express dependencies and things like that. One of the things that we've seen at Datadog there is that that leads to, on one hand, sort of wild growth of abstractions, and on the other hand, like the very verbose code to do certain things. So yeah, I think at Spotify, at the time we were focused really on building a bunch of primitives. There wasn't much in terms of dependency management because Uzi wasn't great. So we built Luigi just to get something, right? And there wasn't a lot of focus on sort of user friendliness for data engineers, while nowadays we're definitely much more focused on it. So maybe that's the biggest difference, like focus on just getting primitives there, getting the tools that you need to just operate this pretty big thing in place. And now we're sort of in a more refinement stage, I think, in general as an industry. But
it's funny coincidence because last week I actually chatted with one of the original authors of Luigi, with Elias Frader, who we both know from Spotify, of course. And it's interesting that together with Eric Bernardsson, the second original author of Luigi, they started a company, and they are developing a solution that simplifies how engineers can run their code in the cloud without setting up an infrastructure by themselves. So as far as I know, they focus now more on execution layer, on easy containerization, not yet scheduling, but in case of implementing any scheduling layer, they definitely have a lot of experience that comes from creating and using Luigi and possibly other tools such as Airflow. So it can be interesting to see what type of solutions they can create together. But let's move on. So when we talked together a few years ago, I remember that you mentioned one interesting difference between Spotify and Datadog that is related to scalability. Let me explain that first. So Spotify grows fast, but this growth is rather predictable. Currently around 20% per year if you look at the number of the users. This is because the number of the users grows organically at Spotify in the countries where Spotify operates, as well as Spotify is entering new countries. But today, Spotify is already operating in many large countries such as the US, Japan, India, Germany. So adding new countries will not cause big spikes in the number of active users and the volume of the data that needs to be handled. However, at Datadog, you can onboard 2 or 3 large customers in a short time frame, and you can see the spike in the amount of the metrics and the volume of the data that you need to store and process. So is this challenge longer applicable, and you need to still face it?
I would say yes and no. Like obviously, because we're fully in the cloud, there's a lot of the reliance on cloud vendors to be able to help us there. They have massive infrastructures to help us scale our current systems. But it does happen where we onboard a new customer and then all of a sudden we get a ton more data. And another dimension there is that Datadog is really a product of small products. It's nicely integrated. Everything's sort of connected with a single interface, and it's easy to set up. But we're constantly expanding sort of our product portfolio. So as of recently, there's a lot of focus on security products and things like that. And with every new product, new data comes in, or our customers send us new types of data. So scalability is definitely a thing. I would say on the data engineering side, with systems like Spark, for example, there are scalability issues for sure that we run into once in a while, but it's not systemic. Luckily, it's, I would say, harder, but it's different on sort of the life side of the product, because we control that part mostly, right? Like for Spark, it's still, we run a Spark job on a bunch of nodes. So it's a little different, but yeah, in general, it's always a concern, I guess, with a growing organization like Datadog.
During last 10 years, did you notice any reusable patterns or skills that are always valid, regardless of how the data engineering landscape changes and regardless of what technologies you can use in the future?
Yeah, I think there are different. There are definitely sort of primitives that are like skills or base skills that are helpful, right? Like for example, if you understand MapReduce, just the algorithm, that at least has helped me to understand future technologies. Even though something like Spark is way more advanced than just map and a reduce function, understanding how these kind of things scale and how these things scale horizontally and why this works, rather than having to scale up a database or some other processing thing, definitely helps. Understanding how dependency management works, I think, is a good thing to it's a skill to have. And if that's through Luigi, Ask-Ban, Airflow, it doesn't matter. The principles are often the same. So they're definitely for people who sort of want to get into data engineering or are data engineers and want to sort of be still current. I think it's important to really invest in some of the fundamentals of data engineering. Like if you take Spark, right? Like it's very highly abstracted. You have a data frame or a data set, and then you sort of apply a bunch of methods on these things, which is great. It's easy to write a job, but I think it's really important to understand what goes on behind the scenes, or to have at least some idea, right? Like you don't have to be a MapReduce or Hadoop expert to understand that, but I think it's definitely helpful to adopt, technology in the future, because as you said, the landscape will change for sure.
Yes, the landscape will change for sure. Hopefully, it will have more and more technologies that address the current challenges. And this brings me to the next question. Do you see any important gaps in the current technologies, or do you wish to see anything particular in the current technologies that will make your job easier and your platform at Datadog better?
Yeah, I think the biggest gap that I think is there still in the big data world is around data management and governance. There are a bunch of projects out there that help in some form or fashion, or that sort of at least solve for certain problems. Like one of my regrets from being at Spotify was that we never invested in that, or not early enough. So what I mean with data management and governance is basically understanding what data you have and where it is and who owns it and how does lineage work? Like how does it relate to each other? like at Spotify, we at some point were like, oh, there's all this data on HDFS. We have X petabytes of data, and like, what is what, and where is certain data, like what data like is important for the commercial part of the business or the financial part of the business, and we had really no idea. So we had sort of mapped that all out, and that was really, really tedious task. And I think there aren't really any sort of good solutions. I know there are a few companies have started up. So our old colleague Laurent Paris started a company around Marquez, for example, and well, they now recently got bought, but being a platform for data management and governance. So that's something that I think we haven't really settled on, as we've settled kind of on Spark and we've settled on kind of Airflow. Like I think Snowflake is a big contender in sort of the SQL-like stuff, like large scale SQL processing. I don't think there's sort of a de facto solution yet for sort of management and governance. And there are solutions out there. Delta Lake by Databricks, for example, I think is some step in the right direction. But yeah, it's something that we haven't, as an industry, haven't really found a default or de facto solution for. At Datadog, we're actually building something. If we open source it or not, that's to be seen. But it's a system called Census, where we basically capture all data all metadata that describes data that is being produced in all sorts of data pipelines, but also databases and like Kafka topics and other sorts of pieces where data lives, to understand lineage, for example, and understand ownership and understand a whole bunch of additional things. Like data quality becomes easier and things like that. So yeah, long story short, long answer short, I think data management and governance is a piece that I'm still sort of within the industry missing.
You mentioned a colleague, Laurent Paris, who we both met at Spotify, that he started a company around Marquez. The name of this company is Datakin, and it focused on building a solution for capturing the data lineage by integrating the Open Lineage and Marquez projects with technologies such as Airflow, Spark, Flink, and many SQL data warehouses that are often used to process the data. And the news is that earlier this year, Datakin was acquired by Astronomer. And in my opinion, this is a very interesting acquisition, and there are many synergies between those two companies. For instance, Apache Airflow is one of the most popular big data technologies, and Airflow DAGs contain a lot of metadata that can be useful to generate the data lineage for your datasets. So I believe that this will accelerate the development of Marquez and Open Lineage projects, and more functionalities for data lineage will be implemented soon, thanks to the integration with Airflow, Spark, Flink, and other projects. So it would be very interesting to invite also Laurent to this podcast to tell us more about their plans, the roadmap, the vision that they would like to achieve related to data governance. But this was only my side comment, so let's go back to our conversation.
I think like one thing that I've learned though over time is that if you start from scratch, it's easy or easier, right? Like you choose processing frameworks, say Spark or Beam. You choose a scheduler or a workflow manager like Airflow. You might like throw in Datakin, or you do something else. There's a bunch of sort of off-the-shelf things that work pretty well together if you're in a greenfield situation. Sort of retroactively applying a bunch of technology is always kind of hard, and it becomes harder the bigger a company becomes and the more complex the environment. So, for example, we are looking to, as I mentioned earlier, to replace Luigi. Exactly how, we're not completely sure. Airflow is obviously a contender. However, there's some doubts there, like to what extent does Airflow solve for what we want to solve for in terms of like user friendliness, for example, and how does this integrate with all the stuff that we've already built? Because there's a ton of sort of bespoke and in-house tools that we've built over the years to do cluster management, for example. So right now we're trying other avenues to sort of deal with that. But it's harder. The more stuff you have, it's harder to sort of integrate new technology in general, or to move from one thing to the next. So.
And you mentioned that data governance, or rather not enough data governance, is your biggest regret from the time that you spent at Spotify. But in my opinion, still, it was a very successful time for you because you contributed a lot to the data platform and data engineering at Spotify. And many of our colleagues would agree that you are the father of data at Spotify. And my final question is, what are the things that you are the most proud of when you look at your work at Spotify in the past and now at Datadog?
It's a good question. I think like when I started Spotify, we were like 3 people, I think, in a team that was called Business Intelligence. We did both sort of maintained what was data infrastructure at the time, small H-based cluster, a bunch of stuff in AWS. And when I left, we had over the years had built, as I mentioned, a 3,600 node Hadoop cluster, like going from like manual configuration to everything automated and stuff like that. And then eventually moving everything to the cloud. That's what I'm pretty proud of, building. So for me, it's like, especially in the role as a director, not only interesting to play and build technology, but also to build teams around that. And having started with a team of 3, and then eventually when I left data infrastructure, and I had moved into a different role by that time, but data infrastructure was like 55, 60 people or so. I'm pretty proud of that. And sort of setting up Spotify to sort of continue doing what they do. It's an awesome company, and the technology was really, really cool. So now for Datadog, I guess a bit of a similar thing. I joined Datadog 3 years ago. I had a team of like 12 people. Now my team is soon to be 70. So that growth is pretty big. Having attacked a few like large pieces of infrastructure, like for example, moving Spark to Kubernetes was a big thing. Now investing in sort of new workflow manager, building census is definitely on the list there, to sort of do data management and governance, and building a team of a team that works on all of this. Plus, focus on the internal analytics as well. So, but I'm not done yet. So that's maybe ask me this question in a few years.
But what you said reminds me that you always focus on projects and initiatives that have large positive impact on your team and your company that you work for. So it's great to hear that you focus on big initiatives at Datadog. So I will definitely ask you in 2 years to learn about new big things that you built at Datadog. And regarding your answer about migration from on-premise to GCP at Spotify, I can add one comment, that it was also impactful for other Swedish companies. So recently I read an interesting article about top 20 most popular big data technologies that are used in Nordics. This article was written a few weeks ago by a Swedish startup called Validio, that builds a data quality platform, and they did a research of technology stacks used by companies in Scandinavia. And based on their findings, BigQuery is one of the most popular technologies in Sweden, and it's significantly more popular in Sweden than in other countries like the US. And one of the hypotheses for increased adoption of BigQuery and GCP in Sweden is the fact that Spotify was early adopter of this cloud, and it basically sent a message in 2015 or 2016 to the market that GCP is very interesting technology, and you can use this cloud in your production use cases, as Spotify did. So this inspired many other Swedish companies to consider using this cloud, such as iZettle, King.com, Epidemic Sound, Truecaller, Leo Vegas, ICA Gruppen, and many other companies as well. And my company, Getting Data, also worked with some of those companies to migrate their data and analytics from on-premise to GCP. For example, we had a very successful data migration journey with Truecaller that was even presented together with us and Truecaller at one of the conferences. And this video is publicly available, so I hope that we also inspired some other Swedish companies to migrate to the cloud from on-premise. And this is very interesting that Spotify was not only pioneer in music streaming, what inspired also other companies to be launched in the music industry in Sweden, music or podcast industry in Sweden. I mean, Epidemic Sound or Soundtrack Your Brand, but also Spotify was pioneer in using the cloud and GCP, what made a lot of impact worldwide on other companies, but especially in Sweden.
Yeah, absolutely. Like one of the reasons behind that back then was like we were in the business of music streaming, right? Like we're not in the business of building data centers, and we was sort of heading that way. So I think it was a good decision to move to the cloud, first of all, and then Google Cloud Platform. Like, geez, Google is just really great with data, and that's like one of the reasons that the network's really fast, and they have some really great data products. Like I'm still like, even though I don't use it, or my teams don't use it, but I'm a big BigQuery fan. I think it's like it's so cool and so awesome. I also really like Apache Beam. So yeah, I think Google has done a lot of good stuff with data products.
As I promised, this was my final question. So I would like to thank you, Wouter, for your time, for sharing your knowledge and opinions with us in this podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. This was so much fun to do. This is actually my first podcast ever, so I hope this worked out. But yeah, thank you for the opportunity, and yeah, good luck, and we'll talk soon.
If you are interested in new episodes of Radio Data, please follow us on Acast, Spotify, and other podcasting platforms. Also visit gettingdata.com to find more information about other ways that we gather and share the knowledge.